Welcome to Saga Thing, where we're putting the sagas of the Icelanders on trial. I'm John.
And I'm Andy. In each episode, we choose a saga, explore its themes and the story, and then we judge the actions of its characters at the Saga Thing.
And today is a very special day for the two of us.
Yes, it is. Today is the day we tackle Viglund Saga, the last of our sagas of the warrior poets. I feel like we should be throwing some confetti, maybe drinking some champagne or something here.
Maybe a little plate of cocktail weenies.
Yeah, well, if that's what you're into, sure.
Well, we've been working on these for a while, and while it's been great exploring this whole subgenre of the sagas, I think we're ready to move on.
Definitely. Now, doing them in succession as we have really, I think, highlights some of the nuances of these otherwise formulaic sagas.
True, but it also highlights the formulas.
Are you saying that's a good thing or a bad thing? I can't really tell.
Just a thing.
Just a thing.
Either way, I think we're both ready to be through with these, moving on to something maybe a little bit less romance-oriented, maybe something more epic in style and scope.
Well, don't get ahead of yourself there, John. We still got this one to deal with. It's a good one, though. I don't want you to sell it short. I really like this one.
Me? You wanted confetti for starting the episode.
Well, I am a little tired of the warrior poets now.
Well, anyway, this is one of the more, one of the less well-studied sagas, I suppose. And in fact, neither one of us was familiar with it beyond the most general idea of its plot. No. But before we get started on the details of our ignorance, why don't you hit the button?
Now, one of the most widely ignored sagas in Icelandic literature. Saga Thing presents the last of the warrior poets' sagas. A spectacle of passion like nothing you've seen before. The epic of a violent and troubled age giving way to a new and romantic ideal. The drama of young lovers. Viglund the Fair, handsome adventurer, son of Thorgrim the Elegant. Ketilrid, Holmkill's daughter, delicate woman, sensible and stalwart. The most beautiful girl in all of Iceland. Viglund's great love. They have eyes only for each other. Driven apart by the scheming of Ketilrid's mother Thorbjorg and her brutish brothers Einar and Jokul. Separate, but never alone. With the aid of his trusty brother Trausti, Viglund will fight for his right to Ketilrid against a culture still hostile to the concept of true love. Can these two overcome the bitter adversity keeping them apart? Challenge the established tradition and finally upset the order of the warrior poet sagas? Listen and learn. This is Viglund Saga. Now, this is actually one of the things I really enjoy about doing this podcast. You know, finding a saga that turns out to be worth much more of my time and attention than I'd previously given it. Which I think in this case is pretty easy because my experience with Viglund Saga was limited to casually observing the fact that it was at the end of my collection of warrior poet sagas.
Well, I mean, you're hardly alone. This one is widely ignored.
Yeah.
And I get the impression that almost everyone else has more or less the same response to what we did. There's almost no critical attention paid to Viglund Saga.
Yeah, we've run into a few of these already. There was, I think, Henthor's Saga, Bjorn's Saga. It does seem like there's a lot of area still to be covered, at least when it comes to English language scholarship for these things.
Yeah, but when someone actually gets around to reading this one, they generally come away sort of grudgingly pleased with it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they're not strewing rose petals in its path or anything, but the general agreement is, well, what I want to read you is a brief commentary from an 1876 review of an edition.
1876? Are you serious?
Yeah, I told you there wasn't much out there.
Oh, my goodness.
This is from a review in The Nation of the Magnuson Morris translation.
Okay.
I'll try to put on a 19th century voice. Though Viglund is a mere fiction and without any historical value, it is composed with taste, and is so successful in imitation of the genuine historical sagas that it might even mislead a reader pretty well acquainted with the sagas in their original form.
That's what they sound like?
Well, that's, you know, I'm a New Yorker, so that's a New Yorker's idea of 19th century speech.
Closest approximation. Well, that's at least fairly positive, but it's not surprising that you're having to look back so far, I don't think. I mean, the fact is that Viglund Saga just isn't taken very seriously by most scholars. I mean, even our old, reliable Christensen only devotes a single short paragraph to Viglund. And most of that's just outlining the plot and dating the saga to the end of the Middle Ages. And he does briefly address the influences on the saga, which are mostly from the more fanciful genres like the Fornoldarsogur or the Riddarasögur.
Right, so the folkloric sagas are the ones based on continental romances.
That's right. And as we're going to see, these comparisons are actually quite legitimate, but they're not the entire story.
No, and this probably isn't what you had in mind, but strangely, some scholars have thought it worthwhile to compare Viglund Saga's poetry with Krakumal, which we covered in a saga brief earlier this month.
That makes no sense. What kind of connection is that? I've read them both. There's no connection. I know we're doing them back to back, but even we can't claim there's any logic to that. It's got to be just a coincidence. Please tell me it's just a coincidence. You didn't plan this.
Well...
Why? Wait. Is it? What are you hiding? What are you hiding?
Well, I'm obviously not going to tell you, am I? I wouldn't be hiding it then. No, the point is you're absolutely right.
Of course I am. No, what am I right about? I don't really know.
The link is that they're nothing alike.
Aha!
The point of comparison is that Krakumal is generally considered to be atypical in some aspects of its poetry, which we talked about, while Viglund Saga is cited as a typical example of saga poetry.
Okay.
Or at least of the more erotic and romantic strain of the genre.
What?
Yeah, I know. That comparison was made as far back as Grenville Pigott in 1839.
Wow. You have been hitting that card catalog pretty hard, haven't you? Now, do you have any comments on the saga from a period after your childhood?
Oh, thank you very much. I told you there isn't much out there.
Okay. So according to this Pigott guy, if our listeners dutifully listen to the Krakumal episode before this one, then their reward is to be familiar with a poem that's nothing at all like the stuff we're about to read.
Yeah, that sums it about.
Well, it has to be said that Viglund doesn't really fit in well with the other warrior poet sagas, for a number of reasons. In fact, Diana Whaley calls it an antidote to the others, noting that it's much closer to the traditions of the continental romance than the rest. We are, she says, in a rather different world in terms of plot, character, morality, and atmosphere than we've seen in the rest of the warrior poets.
It's true that Viglund exists in a slightly different frame of reference from the others. I mean, it's set earlier, and it's written somewhat later, probably in the 15th century. But it's operating from the same stock of plot points, characters, and poetic interludes as the rest of them.
True, but as we'll see, there are a few surprises in store for people who think they know how a warrior poet story is supposed to go.
Ooh, suspense? Are we doing suspense now?
Oh, you just hang in there. I'll tell you later.
Nice, cute.
Now,
okay, let's get into it.
But before we get too deep into it, did you know that there is an opera based on this saga?
I did not know that.
Yes.
You're the opera man, so tell us what you know.
Well, I'll tell you.
Oh, jeez. It's our first Adam Sandler impression in the podcast.
So it was a production by Bennett and Cohen for the Carl Rosa Opera Company in 1890, and it was called Thorgrim. It doesn't tell the whole story of Viglund Saga, just the story of Thorgrim and Olaf. And it did quite well from what I can tell from the reviews of it. But unfortunately there are no productions, recordings, or any other kind of thing that we can examine or I can insert into this podcast or give links to. But you can search out the entire opera.
But do you have you have the libretto and everything? Like you could.
I have the whole thing. Yes. I'm trying to trick my daughter into playing it by just leaving it on the bench.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, it's not going so well.
Right. So this is one of the shorter, well, it's on the shorter side as a saga. It weighs in at what I would call a bantamweight, 12,596 words. So it converts to about 1.38 Hromkel sagas.
Okay, so if this chart that you're keeping is accurate, that puts it just a few hundred words behind Cormac's saga, but still well ahead of Gunnlaug Serpent-Tongue and Halfred Troublesome Poet.
Yeah, but it's missing a cool nickname in the title, which is a little disappointing.
Okay. Hey, why aren't you keeping your little your word count graph on the website? We should have something like that.
Because I'm assuming that no one else cares.
Good point. So where do we begin with this one?
I can put it up there. Well, okay, so I think we have to begin with the introduction of Harold Fairhair in the first chapter.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, we've seen Harold mentioned at the start of sagas before, but never quite like in this one.
Yeah, okay, so if anyone doesn't recall from our earlier episodes, Harold Fairhair was a late 9th century Norwegian who consolidated his kingship over the land by forcing everyone else to acknowledge him as king, and of course to pay him taxes, or as he would have put it, tribute.
Yeah, in other words, he wanted everyone to pay him protection money. Protection from himself.
Right, yeah, that's more or less how the early Icelanders saw it, yes. Yeah. As various factions lost out to Harold, they fled Norway to found new settlements all over the North Sea, and they went as far west as Iceland. And in fact, it's not going too far to say that opposition to Harold was one of the defining characteristics of the settlement generation.
That's right, but what's interesting about the Sagas is how varied their positions regarding Harold actually are. He often appears as the kind of boogeyman of the North, but then sometimes the Sagas are ambivalent about him, as is the case with Hrafnkel Saga, and then other times the Saga's subjects are Harold's supporters. We can see some of those in Erbygge Saga and Egil Saga and other ones like that.
Right, sure. But even within that context, this is a remarkable introduction. Harold, we're told, was the wisest of men and well endowed with all those skills appropriate to his royal dignity. We're told about his generosity, his careful managing of resources, and the high quality of his supporters. Yeah. In other words, this is not the Harold saga writers were envisioning in the early days of saga writing.
Absolutely, but that fits in with what we were saying before. This is a late saga, and it's being written about 150 years after Iceland capitulated to Norway. And there's a certain sense that some of the old bitterness about Norwegian kingship had faded away by this time. And I guess it's not hard to see why. I mean, we're looking at a text written more than 500 years after Harold's rise to power, and at some point, a more distant historical perspective has to enter the equation.
But I think there's even more at play here. This text is also being written around the time of the Kalmar Union, and so there's another layer to the political upheavals and the resulting nostalgias of Icelanders.
Do you want to explain the Kalmar Union at all, or are you going to just drop that in there and move on?
I mean, we can cover it, but let's keep it brief. So the Kalmar Union, was a political unification of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and their subsidiary lands, which included Iceland and Greenland.
Oh, Greenland.
Which came together at the end of the 14th century. I guess you can say it was essentially a defensive move by the Scandinavian countries to counterbalance the power of the Hanseatic League, which was a German-led confederation that was dominating Northern Europe at the time.
Well, down the rabbit hole we go. You said this was going to be brief.
This is brief, believe me. Ultimately, the Kalmar Union was unstable, and it lasted for only just over a century. It did little to improve the lives of Icelanders, and in the long term turned out to be disastrous for the island, because the Norway-Denmark combination that resulted from the Union really wasn't terribly interested in Iceland apart from its productivity as a fishing center.
Yeah, but things weren't all bad, despite the arrival of the Black Death, I guess. I actually know a little bit about the 15th century in Iceland, but mostly from the religious developments. I also know that Iceland benefited from increasing demand throughout Northern Europe for Icelandic cod, especially in England and Germany. The 15th century is, I think, a very fascinating time in Iceland, and I'd love to spend more time talking about it, but I'm not sure yet how much light this sheds on the saga itself. So let's get back to the task at hand, Mr. Digressions.
Well, wow. I'm not the one who had to spend time showing off his knowledge of the 15th century. Alright, so this saga starts with a much more positive view of Harold than we're used to.
Yeah, I thought so too at first. As you get deeper into the first chapter, though, it's not entirely positive. The narrative still makes a point of saying that Harold is ruthless and imposes high taxes, and this is the part I found most interesting. It says that the king seized everything and, quote, many men of high station fled from Norway, for those who came from great families did not tolerate the king's taxes. So the people who flee the king's yoke of oppression, as the saga puts it, still look like the independent-minded Icelanders that we're used to.
It's true. The author seems to want to have it both ways. He's playing into the convention of the Icelanders as freedom-loving expats, but he lacks that tone of visceral hatred toward Harold that some of the earlier sagas sound. In any case, this saga is about some of the families that stay behind in Norway.
Right. It's almost like he's trying to play both sides to some degree, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So our story is going to start out with Viglund's grandparents' generation, but it moves very quickly. So there's an early flurry of names, and it hopefully will sort itself out soon. Now,
Isn't there always?
I had to create a little genealogy for myself on the blank page before the saga starts. And, I gotta say, it filled up very quickly in the first 5 pages. I was constantly flipping back and forth. We start with 3.
So get your pen and paper ready, everyone.
We're gonna start with 3 earls named Thorir, Ketil of Ramarike, and Eric of Rogaland. All 3 of these are supporters of King Harold, and they all live in Norway.
Okay, so let's start with Thorir. Thorir is what I would call an extreme helicopter parent. He has one daughter named Olaf the Radiant. He's devoted to her care, but he won't let any man see her or talk to her. So And he means it. He has an entire compound built with fences and locked gates, and he turns away any man who comes to try and win her.
That's nice. And, as I read that, I thought it sounded a lot like Thora Fortress Heart from Ragnar Saga, which maybe is not a total coincidence. There are a lot of formulaic elements to the later sagas, and this idea of the Forbidden Princess shows up periodically. But there's no dragon this time, unfortunately.
No, but there are going to be a number of rivals vying for Olaf's hand. Earl Eric has 3 sons, Sigmund, Helgi, and an illegitimate son named Thorgrim.
Mm-hmm.
He loves all 3 of his sons, but Thorgrim is treated with less respect than the others due to his what we'll call extramarital origins.
That's a nice euphemism.
Thank you. Well, it didn't seem as if anyone in Eric's court makes much of an issue of Thorgrim's parentage, so I thought we ought to keep it polite.
There's actually a lot of variety in how illegitimate children are treated in the sagas, and it seems like the cultural expectation was that each family would sort it out for themselves. Now, sometimes, as in Thorgrim's case, the illegitimate son is especially loved by the father, Jon Snow, and so he's helped to an advantageous position in society. Usually, though, that position involves having to move on from the family home at some point, since the legitimate sons or son would expect to inherit their father's land and position.
Well, that's almost exactly what happens here. When King Harold comes to visit Eric, the Earl introduces his 3 sons to the king, and Thorgrim is quite forward. He pushes himself past his brothers and gives the king a big hug.
This seems like a really big breach of protocol.
Are you an expert in Norwegian royal protocol?
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm writing a little monograph on the subject right now.
Oh, well, that'll be useful.
Yeah, we'll get back on it.
In this case, it works out. Harold thinks Thorgrim is a charming little scamp. So he gives him an arm ring, and when he leaves, he takes the boy on as his valet. Thorgrim isn't popular with the jealous hangers-on in Harold's retinue, and they begin to mockingly call him Thorgrim the Elegant.
See, I always assumed that Thorgrim was just elegant.
No, they are mocking his pretensions. Yeah. Right, we'll get into this with the nicknames, but it's not a compliment.
Now, Thorgrim spends some time traveling around with Harold and has a few adventures. And on one occasion, when Thorgrim is serving at a table of one of Harold's men, he accidentally spills some drink onto a boisterous man named Grim. Grim begins shouting, as a boisterous man named Grim might, and he makes an unkind reference to Thorgrim's background.
Well, let's not mince words. He calls him a whore's son, more suited to feeding slop to swine than drink to respectable men. Those are harsh words.
Those are very harsh words. And Thorgrim's not the sort of guy to let that kind of thing go. So he draws his sword and runs Grim through.
Wow.
Reasonable.
I do have to kind of wonder why the serving boy is carrying a sword, but okay.
Yeah. Well, Harold supports Thorgrim's right to kill Grim for the insult, and he offers to pay compensation to Grim's cousin, who also happens to be the host. And it has to be said that Grim apparently wasn't much liked by anyone, because that's the end of it, and the feasting goes on.
Did they at least clear the corpse away?
The text doesn't actually say, but you would assume so. Or at least kick it under the table.
Right, well, presumably when they cleared away the soup bowls. Yeah. Sometime later, King Harold invites a number of important earls to his court, and among them are Olaf's father Thorir and Earl Ketil of Raumarika.
Right. Now, we mentioned a little while ago that there were 3 important earls in our story. Well, Ketil is the 3rd one. He's a firm supporter of Harold's, a renowned dueler with 24 Holmgang victories to his credit. He has 2 sons, Gunnlaug the Boisterous and Sigurd the Wise. He's also got a young daughter named Ingebjorg, but his wife died in childbirth. So he's looking for a foster mother for his kids, and he's also heard of the lovely Olaf.
Right, and that's all well and good, but of course, by now, we know how this is going to go in the Warrior Poet sagas. Thorgrim sees Olaf at court and immediately falls in love with her. They meet in private a few times.
No, wait a minute. Thorir builds an entire Ultramax prison to keep Olaf from prying eyes of men, and then he brings her along to a gala at the king's court?
Well, what better place for Olaf's quinceañera?
Oh, is that what it is?
She's of age, she's beautiful, and the upkeep on that security compound has got to be expensive.
Well, it is true that he's not against her marrying at all. He just wants to control who she marries, which is kind of important.
Right. And at Harold's, Thorir can survey the eligible bachelors of Norway and look for a suitable young man with the potential to sweep Olaf off her feet via the time-honored method of being rich and sucking up to her father.
So he's looking for an 80s teen movie villain to marry his daughter?
Yeah, I guess so. Hey, yeah, he kind of is. Can we get Billy Zabka to play a suitor?
Thorgrim does have a certain Daniel the Karate Kid vibe to him now that you mention it.
I didn't mention it. Anyway, Olaf seems to be in love with Thorgrim, but her father ignores Thorgrim's offer to marry her.
As you'd expect. But that's not going to stop Thorgrim. He visits Olaf at her home, and though Thorir says no to the proposal, Thorgrim and Olaf continue to be on good terms.
Right, and once again, we're forced to ask about the point of that compound. Why have an impregnable fortress for your daughter if you're going to let her out when an earl's illegitimate son comes nosing around the place?
I totally agree. But Thorir doesn't have to wait long before another proposal arrives in the form of Earl Ketil and 30 of his men. Now, Ketil...
Well, the proposal's only from Ketil.
Right. Yeah, it's an awkward marriage. Ketil and King Harold both attend the feast at Thorir's house, and with the support of Harold, Ketil wins Thorir's permission to marry Olaf.
Oh, that's handy. Did anybody ask Olaf?
No, they didn't. There's 30 men there. But I'm glad you mentioned it. We are starting to get into a really interesting theme of this particular saga, the issue surrounding consent in marriage.
Oh, yes. So what's happening here?
Well, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, so let's just work our way through this saga first, and then we can chat about consent theory in 15th century Iceland after we finish.
Sounds riveting.
I will just say this to our listeners. Pay attention to issues of consent in this saga. It's a very big deal.
Yeah, sure. Actually, the author underlines Olaf's lack of consent in her own marriage with the poem's first verse. And I guess I'll take this one.
Okay.
I know the glad Goldwarden wields better words than others. The sound of these words will wound me in this world. Here dwells no handsome man who'll draw my love to him. But one received my oath, and ever that bright man I'll love.
I love the understatement of the line immediately following that verse. Most people were convinced that Olaf would have rather had Thorgrim.
See? And they didn't need to sit around parsing Olaf's poem or anything.
No. There's really a noticeably different tone to this saga, isn't there? I mean, it's got all the elements of the other warrior poet sagas, but it seems to be having an additional conversation with later medieval continental writing. And like those continental romances, it spends a bit more time exploring the characters' feelings than earlier sagas. Ooh, I'm getting all excited now. This is good stuff.
Well, you're in good company.
Yeah.
Thorgrim is also a little worked up. If I can drag us back to the text. Thorgrim tells off King Harold for supporting another man's claim on Olaf, using the time-honored, I saw her first argument.
It works.
Rejects Harold's offer to compensate him with the hand of Ketil's daughter Ingebjorg in marriage, and resigns from Harold's company.
This reminds me of how I met my wife, actually. So Harold is also engaging in the game of promising women in marriage without their consent.
Sure, but is that really your biggest issue with the situation?
Yeah, why?
How old is Ingebjorg?
Oh. Yeah, that's creepy.
Yeah. Unless we've had a massive leap forward in time, she's got to be a very young child.
Yeah.
Her precise age isn't given, but the text implies pretty strongly that Ketil hasn't been a widower all that long. And Ingebjorg's mother died giving birth to her. So, yeah, ew.
No, maybe he wants to put her in the bullpen and save her to later.
Good lord.
Okay, so now that you mention it, that's probably the effect the author's going for, but the good news is that Thorgrim doesn't take the offer. Yay! Instead, he rushes to the wedding feast at Ketil's home, where Ketil claims that Olaf is his because her father has the right to make such decisions for her. And Thorgrim doesn't bother to argue at all. Instead, he steals the bride away by having his men extinguish the lights in the hall to allow him to escape with Olaf.
Right. Now, Thorgrim and Olaf know they can't stay in Norway now that they've offended a powerful friend of the king. So, like others before them, they set sail for Iceland.
Yes.
They settle in the Snæfellsnes region, and word later comes that Thorgrim has been outlawed in Norway.
Which is not a surprise, but we are not done with Earl Ketil. He'll be popping up again.
Oh, not by a long shot.
Yeah.
But stick a pin in that for now, because we're going to spend some time with Thorgrim and Olaf's happy marriage and their kids.
Sure, we got to get to this generation of the title character. Right?
So, they settle down and have 3 children in 3 years. 2 sons named Trausti and Viglund, and a daughter named Helga.
It is about time. I mean, this is Viglund Saga, and I was starting to wonder if we'd ever hear the guy's name. And we just covered a whole opera's worth of material.
I know. And of course, because this is a warrior poet saga, we need a neighbor's daughter for Viglund to fall in love with.
Ah, yes.
And so?
And conveniently, we're introduced to a neighbor, whose name is Holmkill of Foss. Holmkill and his wife Thorbjorg also have 2 sons and a daughter. The boys are called Jokul and Einar, and the daughter is a local beauty by the name of Ketilrid.
Ketilrid?
Yeah.
That's quite a name.
Well, she's quite a woman. She's also part of a nearly unique relationship in the sagas. Ketilrid and her mother Thorbjorg don't like each other at all.
Oh, yeah. No, I find this fascinating. Most sagas don't really attend to the relationships among women. Mm-hmm. And when they do, they usually look at women of the same generation. Halgirth and Bergthor in Jarl Saga, for example.
Right.
Or Asgerd and my thing woman, Aud Vesten's daughter, in Gisli Saga.
And those relationships usually exist as an extension of the social world of men. Asgerd and Aud are married to the Sorsen brothers, and Bergthor and Halgirth are married to Njal and his best friend Gunnar, respectively. Their interactions only take place because of their menfolk, and sometimes their relationships complicate the relations of men, but they rarely stand in the center of the saga narrative itself.
Right, and put it this way, if there were a Bechdel test for sagas, it would have about the same pass rate as Hollywood films.
My goodness.
Which is to say it would have an abysmal pass rate.
A Bechdel test for sagas?
Yeah, if listeners don't know what the Bechdel test is, go look it up. It's worth knowing about.
Right. It has something to do with female characters talking to each other about something other than a man, right?
Well, yes, okay. If you want to just tell them about it, then yes,
well, I'm
that's
trying to save them the trouble of looking it up. So,
sure.
Now, despite the fact that it is a terrible movie, Frozen does quite well in the Bechdel test. So, there's that.
Oh my. You realize you just invited our first hate mail, don't you?
Listen, if you want to argue with me about the inner workings of Frozen, I'm willing to do it. But I have a daughter named Elsa, and maybe that's tainted my appreciation of the film a little bit.
Oh, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, exactly. Everywhere this poor girl goes, she's hit with the let it go, let it go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's neither here nor there. Back to the...
I actually have to be honest, I haven't seen it.
Oh, good for you. So back to the Bechdel test for a moment. I want to linger on this, Mr. Digressions. If I understand it all correctly, there are some sagas that would pass, and they do show women interacting in meaningful ways.
Yes.
Take the example of Eric the Red saga, where tensions over the conversion to Christianity are partly played out through the interaction between the young Christian Gudrid and the fortune-telling diva Thorbjorg of Greenland.
Yeah, see, now, and what I find especially interesting about that is that Gudrid and the fortune teller also represent different generations.
Yeah.
And the question of religion is inextricably linked to generations in Eric's saga. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's kind of how the story is told. In Viglund, we get a different kind of generational divide. A mother and daughter who just don't get along.
That's true, but it's in part because the mother doesn't like girly things. She doesn't like sewing, and she doesn't want to teach her daughter to do any of that stuff.
Right. Although it's important to keep in mind, this isn't really a fully fleshed out relationship. We're never told why Thorbjorg hates her daughter so much.
That's true.
Although that may have something to do with it, right? That Ketilrid is, as the female lead in a romance, corresponds more closely to a kind of generic ideal of womanhood.
Right.
And Thorbjorg does not. But whatever the reason, it's a rare and intriguing relationship to have a look at.
Yeah, and that's not the only reason that Ketilrid's worth paying attention to. She's also much more outspoken and independent-minded than the women we've been seeing. I mean, even Steingerd from Cormac's saga isn't as formidable as Ketilrid.
For example?
Well, when Viglund tries to turn a conversation between them toward a pledge of love, she refuses initially and gives 3 pretty good reasons. Right. First, she says men are too fickle to trust in such things. Second, because she doesn't wish to hurt her father, whose opinion she respects. And third, because her mother would never allow it.
And the order of those is interesting. She makes a point of smacking Viglund down with the men are fickle line before acknowledging that her parents are in the way.
Yeah. She does soften the blow a bit by saying that she would prefer to marry Viglund if she had her way, but she doesn't see any easy way for that to happen, given the circumstances.
Oh, see, you can't say something like that to a guy whose parents eloped by escaping from a hall full of armed men.
Yeah.
That's just going to encourage him.
Probably true. But Thorbjorg isn't just a difficult and domineering mother. She's also out of her freaking mind. She's crazy.
Yup. Yeah, she's battier than a guano cave.
Yeah.
And her sons, Einar and Jokul, are also, I think the technical term is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
Yeah, they actually, as I'm reading, they remind me of a more vicious version of Corey and Trevor from Trailer Park Boys.
What?
But since most of our listeners won't get that reference, we'll keep going.
Half of us don't get that reference. Carry on.
This is where the saga takes a real turn for the crazy. Let's start with their initial plan to destroy Viglund's family. Einar wants an excuse to fight Viglund's father, Thorgrim, and so he comes up with a plan. He's going to try to seduce Viglund's mother.
This is just astoundingly stupid.
Yeah.
Among other things, he just sort of assumes that the seduction part is a foregone conclusion.
Right.
He seems to think that he's just irresistible to women.
Well, and of course, that's where he's wrong. Olaf is not a woman to be crossed lightly, and her response is to dress a servant in her cloak, wait until Einar approaches the servant, and then jump into the room dressed as a black-cloaked man with a sword. Oh, she's so cool.
Oh, she is.
Einar is frightened of this mysterious warrior in black, and when Olaf says that Thorgrim's on his way into the house, Einar and Jokul run away quickly.
It's just great.
Yeah.
The use of the dark cloak is a nice touch as well, since, of course, anyone who knows the sagas knows this is a signification of someone bent on a killing.
Right. But, of course, Thorbjorg and her sons aren't done scheming just yet.
No. Their next plan is to goad Viglund into a horse fight, pitting his stallion Blekur against their champion fighting horse Brunin.
Yeah, this is another ridiculous plan, since it really doesn't seem to have a clear point at all, aside from maybe embarrassing Viglund by being better than him at animal cruelty.
Right, and of course it turns out they can't do that right either.
No.
Viglund's horse kicks Brunin's teeth out before biting him to death.
Nay,
at which
say
point
it ain't so.
I also want to point out, by the way, the names of these horses just indicate how kind of archetypal this whole story gets at times. Brunin means black horse, and Blekur means pale horse.
There you go. The good and the
they
bad.
aren't even really given names so much as colors.
Yeah. That's not unusual for horses.
Anyway, so at that point, after their horse is dead, the brothers and their men grab their weapons, Viglund's group grabs their weapons, and finally we're just having a big brawl.
Which, if that's what you want, you don't really need to lose a horse to do. You know?
True. By the time the two sides separate, one of Viglund's men and two of the brothers' men are dead.
Well, that's good for our body count, isn't it?
True.
But the stupid just keeps coming. One night, Einar and Jokul sneak onto Viglund's family's property. They try to steal some horses, but Viglund's stallion Blekur keeps moving the herd so that they can't catch any of them. And finally, they get so frustrated that they attack Blekur.
And they turn out to be failures at that, too. The stallion fights them both off for hours.
Hold on, say that one more time.
The stallion fights them both off for hours.
That's ridiculous.
Presumably kicking 7 kinds of crap out of them in the process.
Yeah, it's so ludicrous. Eventually, though, they do remember that they have spears with them, and they are able to stab Blekur to death.
A moment of silence, please, for one fantastic horse.
I would love to. There's no time, though. They have to cover up their crime. So they drag this dead horse to a cliff, and they push it off, hoping that it'll look like an accident.
Absolute criminal geniuses.
I know. And then they steal 2 prize oxen from the property, bring them home, slaughter them, and hang the corpses up in their shed.
See, now this is suddenly starting to sound like a horror film. A horror film with idiots for killers, admittedly, but still.
Sure enough. And when Viglund and his brother Trausti find Blekur's corpse, it's pretty obvious he has multiple deep stab wounds, and he was dragged up to the cliff.
I suppose we should be impressed that they didn't leave their spears in the wounds with a note saying, "It weren't us that did it. Love, Einar and Jokul."
Worse than that, their father realizes what happened, and he insists on letting Viglund's dad, Thorgrim, name his own price for the oxen, and the whole thing only brings Thorgrim and their father Holmkel closer together.
And they're still not done.
No.
Their mother now contracts with a witch to kill Viglund and Trausti. And next time the brothers are out fishing, the witch manages to call up a storm that blows their ship out to sea.
Ooh.
Yes. And so for one brief moment, they think they've succeeded.
Yes.
And Ketilrid goes into mourning at the thought of losing Viglund.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like she even waited very long to have those feelings.
No, honestly. But the brothers and their friend Bjorn are able to put in to shore a little ways away. Mm-hmm. They spend a pleasant evening with an elderly settler named Thorkel Skinswathed, and they row home the next day.
It's just unbelievable. Now, this is also one of those moments when Viglund Saga starts to sound a little bit off for a family saga.
Grown men doing violent and stupid things in equal measure. No, it sounds right to me.
No, that part's fine. Totally predictable. But there is a lengthy sidebar at this point in the story on the nature of forbidden love, and the entire tone shifts. For a moment, we might be reading the literature of a different culture entirely, I think.
Oh, yeah. I think this is the section you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They had such a secret love concealed in their hearts, that their deeply entrenched love and the fruit of their affection could never be uprooted from their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
For the fire of affection and the flames of love burn all the more intensely, and weld together the hearts and minds of lovers all the more tightly, the greater the number of those who wish to injure them. It actually goes on like that for quite a while.
And then we're right back into the usual saga hijinks. Yeah. It's a strange aside, but it's not really out of place, I don't think. It just reflects a changing aesthetic among writers and readers of the sagas, and I think a changing culture as well.
Sure, but I think it also explains, in part, why this saga isn't universally agreed upon as belonging to the Icelandic genre. There's some really strange stuff going on in here.
Anyway, I think we'll talk about all of that in the judgment section, so let's get back to the action.
Okay, so a ship's captain now arrives from Norway.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Håkon, and he's been sent by Viglund's old enemy, Ketil of Raumarík. He's been sent to kill Thorgrim to avenge that whole running away with his bride thing.
Yeah. Well, and to make matters worse for Viglund's family, Håkon arrives in Iceland and allies himself with Einar and Jokul, which is not a good thing.
Yeah, Håkon's a curious figure. He must be a desirable match because he's being offered marriages everywhere he goes.
Must be Studley.
Well, so Ketil first offers his daughter Ingebjorg as the prize for killing Thorgrim, and then Einar and Jokul offer their sister Ketilrid as wife or mistress to Håkon in exchange for his friendship.
This is a new low. They want to offer her as wife or mistress?
Yes.
Mistress?
And the complex moral issues at play here don't seem to bother Håkon in the slightest.
They're like the nasty stepsisters of folktales, these guys.
Oh, they're awful.
In this regard.
They're just awful.
Yeah.
So Håkon is fine with this. He immediately asks them to retrieve Ketilrid from her foster home with Viglund's parents so that he can waste no time in putting the moves on her. And as if this weren't uncomfortable enough already, it's their mother, Thorbjorg, who makes the arrangements to have Ketilrid brought home for Håkon's enjoyment.
Ugh.
It's really grotesque.
It sure is. Now, Viglund and Ketilrid are obviously unhappy about the parting, and it's at this point, as he says goodbye to his love, that we finally get a verse out of Viglund.
Well, it's about time.
Yeah. He says, I'll never love on earth a young Valkyrie of silk. Men will not observe this, other than you, woman. Fair maiden, mind the oaths and vows made long ago, though an arrogant woman is eager to destroy us. It's not really all that warrior poety.
No, it's really not. I think Viglund, he may be all the warrior that we could hope him to be, but he's not all the poet we could hope him to be.
Well, I wonder if it's not so much Viglund's fault as the author, who's living far enough away from that time period that he's just not into, and maybe he knows his audience isn't looking for standard skaldic poetry.
Right, and I think we'll see later on that Viglund is actually unusual even in this saga for the sort of simplicity and straightforwardness of his lines.
Yeah. But I bet if you dig through 15th century Icelandic poetry, you'd find stuff that sounds a lot more like this than you would the stuff that we've been reading.
Yeah, no, I actually believe that's entirely right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ketilrid does have one ally at home. Her father, Holmkill.
Yeah, I love this guy.
He contrives a plan. He keeps her by his side day and night so that Håkon can't get her alone.
Now, this next section involves some fairly typical scenes of rising tension between Viglund and his enemies. Things get pretty heated at some local games, and Jokul throws a ball into Viglund's face, which splits his eyebrow open. And when Thorgrim sees this, he calls Viglund his daughter for failing to retaliate for the blow.
Oh, boo, Thorgrim.
Yeah, gender shaming. And in the next game, Viglund concusses Jokul with a blow to the head and knocks him to the ground. It's a real concussion, described as a concussion.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Viglund and Ketilrid meet at the games whenever they can and allow themselves to be seen in affectionate moments together as much as possible.
That shaming of Viglund really is interesting. I think a lot of readers of the sagas tend to think of that sort of goading as typically a trick used by mothers and other women. Mm-hmm. But it's not all that rare to see older men shaming younger men into action with the same trick.
Right, we'll see that a bit.
Right. And Thorgrim's clever about it. When Viglund's brother Trausti asks their father to clarify who he's calling a woman, Thorgrim, instead of directly attacking, points out that the bandage on Viglund's head looks like a woman's wimple.
It's a good line. But meanwhile, things are really heating up between the families. Viglund and Trausti spend a day visiting Ketilrid at her family's house, and when they head off, they're confronted by a dozen men from Foss, led by Einar and Jokul, who have been, I think they're waiting in ambush behind haystacks.
Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, Viglund and Trausti are expecting trouble and came well armed, and a brawl breaks out. And it rapidly becomes obvious that the men from Foss are outclassed. Mm-hmm. Viglund and Trausti kill 3 men without taking a single wound.
Awesome.
The survivors run away, and Einar and Jokul cover their embarrassment by claiming that they were the victims of the attack.
Wait a minute. So they're claiming that Viglund and Trausti ambushed a dozen men?
Yes.
Doesn't that make them look worse?
Again, yes. But it does help them to finally move their father, who believes their story, and in a moment of anger agrees to marry Ketilrid to Haukon.
Now, once again, the author breaks in to point out that this marriage is made without Ketilrid's consent. And as we've said, that's an important point, and one that this author is really, really working hard to make stand out in the text. And I'm not sure about you, John, but this part of the saga really ticked me off.
What's that?
Well, I really didn't want Ketilrid to end up with Haukon. The whole thing bothers me.
Okay, but you know the formula of the warrior poet saga, so how are you surprised?
I don't know if I was surprised, but I was disturbed. This saga is a little different from the others, and I actually found myself genuinely invested in Ketilrid's developing relationship with Viglund. Sappy as that may sound.
I'd say that's true for me to a degree.
Thank you. Now, there's a quality to the writing in this saga that we don't often see in saga literature, or at least that's how I feel right now, having read it recently.
Okay, but you don't mean to say that the other sagas are poorly written.
Definitely not. But at the same time, I was really rooting for these two to get together, in part because of the way the narrator handles the lovers. I mean, the agenda here is different, so the handling of their relationship is different as well. There's a real passion here and a semblance of what we modern audience understand as actual love. Think of that passage that you just quoted where the narrator explains the nature of true love and how it's so deeply entrenched and how the fruit of their affection could never be uprooted from their hearts and how the fire of affection and the flames of love burn all the more intensely and weld together the hearts and minds of lovers all the more tightly.
You don't think that's a bit Hallmark card?
Well, yeah, under normal circumstances, yes. But here it works for me for some reason.
See, I actually prefer the simple, understated love of a Gisli and Aud.
Oh, that's nice.
Where there's sort of little moments of loyalty shown and interreliance shown.
I like those as well.
But, sure. A lot of what we're seeing in this saga is just taken from continental romances like the Tristan and Isolde story. Mm-hmm. In fact, the few times Viglund's saga comes up in scholarship, it's often to reference the awkwardness of these shifts into and out of the prose romance tradition.
Look, I'm not saying it's the best written saga in the world, but I think it's pretty well put together. In fact, I think it may be one of the more accessible and memorable of the sagas we've covered so far.
Ooh, those are strong words.
Well, I'm going to stand by them. For now, at least, having just read the saga. Now, this is also the only saga that got a real emotional response out of me. I remember reading the part where Ketilrid is given to Haukon during my daughter's oboe lesson, and I had to exert a lot of self-control not to scream out and throw this book across the room, which wouldn't have gone over very well at all. I mean, Ketilrid's marriage to Haukon is just wrong on every level.
Okay, well, I have to call shenanigans on this only because I seem to remember you getting quite worked up about Henthorer.
Well, yeah, maybe.
But this is a different kind of emotion.
Different emotion.
And of course, the point is to work you up, isn't it? The point is to upset you this way.
Yeah, absolutely. It just ticks me off partly because it's a victory for Ketilrid's awful mother and her dopey brothers, and partly because I believed in the love between Ketilrid and Viglund. You call me a sap if you want, but I felt something.
Well, if you're having that kind of reaction 600 years after it was written, I'd say the saga author did his job well enough.
You're darn tootin' he did.
I think it's also noteworthy for building that kind of feeling you're talking about that Holmkill soon learns the truth of what happened at the haystacks, and he has a great deal of regret over having decided Ketilrid's marriage for her.
Even within 2 paragraphs, he learns.
Right, absolutely. He even then travels with her to the next games that are held, so he allows her to see Viglund again, and he warns Viglund to be on his guard against the plotting of Einar and Jokul.
Yeah. Now, for anyone who's confused by these families, Holmkill is essentially warning Viglund about Holmkill's own sons and their treachery. That's really serious, and it represents a complete severing of the family loyalty that usually governs saga action.
Okay, so I think we have to ask ourselves, why does he do it? Especially since he knows that Viglund is the superior fighter. Is this a case of Holmkill acknowledging Viglund's claim as his quote-unquote real son-in-law? Or is he just disowning his sons and their scheming at this point?
I'm not exactly sure. I have a couple theories on this. My first guess would be that this is the saga author wanting us to use... my first guess would be that the saga author wants to use Holmkill and his family as an example of what can happen from a bad match. I mean, Holmkill and his wife are a terrible husband-wife team. I don't think they like each other very much at all. And since the sons have this vindictive nastiness of the mother, I'd guess Holmkill isn't a huge fan of them either, despite the blood relationship. Ketilrid, on the other hand, is sweet and good and rational, nothing like her mother. And as a good father, he genuinely seems to want what's best for her and not for himself or his family, which is a real departure from other saga fathers. It's also one of the things that I think is maybe the second point here, that this saga author is interested in breaking away from that tradition of family first and looking towards something that we'll talk about in the judgment section.
Okay. Well, either way, whichever goal he's got in mind, the actual narrative at this point is Viglund and Trausti have been alerted by Holmkill, and so they're aware of the dangers they head home. And sure enough, they spot another 12-man ambush waiting at the same haystacks they were attacked at before.
The same haystacks?
Yeah.
These guys really suck at surprise attacks.
Yup. And so this time, the brothers leap up onto the haystacks to fight from higher ground.
Right, so this fight breaks out, but no one can get a clean shot at anyone because of the distance between them. I mean, they're essentially just clashing the tips of their weapons together and making angry faces.
Right. So obviously the smart move here is stay up there, fight off the attempts by Einar and Jokul's gang to climb up, and wait for them to get bored, or for someone to come looking for them.
You know, maybe hang some shiny things and throw them into the field and they'll run away. Well, that might be your move, but clearly you lack the fragile ego and capacity for mayhem of Viglund Thorgrimsson. Jokul shouts up to them, "We'll know you're not a real man unless you come down here and fight us." What is a man to do in a situation like this?
I just want to point out that Jokul and Einar have Håkon and 9 more men with them.
Well, Viglund has Trausti, his trusty companion.
And of course, he has the strength of a man whose masculinity has just been questioned by a schoolyard taunt.
Yes.
So, of course, Viglund and Trausti leap down off the hay, and they go on a complete crazy monkey rampage. In minutes, 7 of the attackers are dead, and 2 more are out of the fight with injuries. But Trausti is also badly wounded.
This is the sort of bloodbath we've been missing in the last few sagas, and we're not done yet. Jokul now takes charge, commanding Einar to face off against Trausti, while Viglund fights Håkon. Now, of course, that means that Jokul is going to have a chance to rest.
Oh, nice for him. Meanwhile, Einar and Trausti hack away at each other until both of them fall.
Oh, I'm going to miss Einar. His schemes were almost as stupid as Narfi's in Cormac's saga.
That's true. So anyway, now we're down to Viglund facing off against both Håkon and Jokul. Except Jokul still doesn't enter the fight, so Håkon and Viglund start fighting. Håkon is an accomplished warrior, and he manages to wound Viglund badly, but Viglund finally chops him down. And now, Jokul, well-rested and in full health, attacks the wounded and exhausted Viglund.
It's a titanic struggle. We don't actually get a description of Jokul, but his name means glacier, and most men with that name are on the large side.
And of course, he's been resting up during the fighting.
Right. But Viglund is a fighting fiend. He's in his monkey rampage, as you so eloquently put it. And his injuries aren't even slowing him down. Both men are fighting to avenge their fallen brothers at this point, so it's pretty serious stuff.
Right. And the fight goes on for hours until it lasts the better part of the day. Viglund is slowly weakening from loss of blood, and he realizes he's going to lose unless he does something drastic. But he knows something Jokul doesn't know.
What's that?
Viglund is not left-handed.
You proud of yourself? You like doing that?
Actually, he is left-handed. More to the point, he's ambidextrous.
Yes, he is.
Which is a tremendous advantage in a fight. He throws his shield and axe up in the air, switches hands, and swings the axe with his left hand.
Awesome.
Jokul is entirely thrown off, can't make the necessary counter move, and Viglund chops his sword arm off at the elbow.
I am calling it right now. That is winning Best Bloodshed. It's got to. There's no competition.
It's fairly awesome. As a lefty myself, I'm a big fan. This is, by the way, it's apparently a real fighting technique, although obviously a risky one, since a mistake would leave you dropping your weapon or shield in the middle of a fight.
Mm-hmm. In this case, it does pay off, though, and Jokul attempts to flee, wounded as he is. Viglund's also too badly wounded to chase him, so he grabs a spear and throws it through Jokul's back and straight out his chest. Jokul crashes to the earth, but Viglund collapses from loss of blood. It's pretty violent stuff.
Love it. The two injured men from Foss ride off back home and announce that Håkon, Einar, Jokul, Viglund, and Trausti are all dead, along with 7 other men.
Ketilrid, poor woman that she is, hears the news and drops into a faint, which her mother angrily and correctly interprets as a reaction to the news of Viglund's death, rather than that of her brother's.
Right.
Thorbjorg demands that Holmkill ride out and kill Thorgrim in revenge, but Holmkill refuses since, as he says, there's nothing more anyone involved can pay, so what's the point?
This is a grim ending to the saga, but it's not unexpected.
Yeah.
But what is unexpected is that we're not done yet.
Oh, no, not at all. The narrative now shifts back to the battlefield, where we learn that Viglund is still alive and conscious. Yay!
Hooray!
That's not a tremendous surprise, since we were already told that he falls as if he were dead. But he staggers over to his brother, where he and we get a real shock. Trausti is alive as well. But both brothers are too badly injured to go any further, and all Viglund can do is try to bind up Trausti's wounds.
Yeah, this really is a surprise. As we've said before, the brothers in these warrior poet sagas are usually contrasting personalities to the main figure. Trausti's an exception. He's mostly just a less interesting version of Viglund. I honestly figured that his narrative purpose was to get killed.
Yeah, so did I. And I marked it down as soon as it happened and then was disappointed. But this is the point where this saga really moves into a different tradition from the other poet sagas. The move is actually somewhat jarring, but it's a nice shift after reading so many of those warrior poet stories in a row. And I think probably, in a culture where they were reading these kind of things over and over again, you at some point you need to shift. You need to do something different.
Right. And in this case, the brothers are actually rescued by their father and then hidden away for an entire year while they recover from their wounds. Meanwhile, Ketilrid's mother Thorbjorg is suspicious of the lack of corpses and mourning at Thorgrim's house. You'd think they'd at least tried to do a fake funeral.
Right.
And so she gets her father, Einar of Lon, to take up a case against Viglund and Trausti for the deaths of the men from Foss.
Yeah. In this case, we really see the weakness of the law, which is often a theme of the sagas written in the earlier period. But I think it's interesting to see it here as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. The case is won easily, so now we have to deal with a new plot point. The brothers are under sentence of outlawry. It's clear from later context that this is minor outlawry. So a 3-year sentence of exile, not the stronger permanent exile.
Okay, so the next section of the saga opens with the arrival of 2 men named Gunnlaug the Boisterous and Sigurd the Wise. Remember them?
Right. Okay, yeah. Now, we mentioned these two way back at the beginning of the saga. These are the sons of Ketil of Raumarike, the man who was scheduled to marry Olaf until Thorgrim crashed the wedding.
It's all coming together like a Shakespearean plot.
See that?
Gunnlaug and Sigurd have been sent by their father to kill Thorgrim again, since Håkon never got around to it. But in the tradition of badly executed plots in this saga, they shipwreck off the Icelandic coast and have to be rescued off the beach by Thorgrim.
Right. Now that should be a golden opportunity for them. Because, I mean, this is the guy they've been sent to kill, and here he is all by himself.
Yeah, sure. It's a great opportunity if you're a complete jerk. He's rescuing them. And these guys aren't like their father. They're both essentially honorable men, and Sigurd in particular has taken a vow never to repay good with evil.
Which is a weirdly specific oath given the circumstances.
It's a good oath, and it's not that weird, and it's not nearly as weird as Gunnlaug's oath, which is never to refuse a spot on a ship to someone whose life depends on it.
Yeah, hang on to that one. Meanwhile, the brothers spend the winter with Thorgrim's family. They never learn about Viglund and Trausti in their convalescent hideaway. Apparently they're being hidden really well. But Sigurd does fall in love with Viglund's younger sister, Helga.
Convenient. Now, there are going to turn out to be a lot of people getting married by the end of this thing.
Yup. So at the end of the winter, Viglund and Trausti emerge from hiding, and on their father's advice ask Gunnlaug for safe passage out of Iceland, using the aliases Trouble-Prone and Problem-Prone.
Nice.
And Gunnlaug can't refuse because, surprise, surprise, he's taken an oath about this very thing.
This is getting very convenient.
That's true. I mean, whether you approve or not depends on personal taste, but from a critical perspective, there's a definite sense of bleed over from the more fairy tale-ish romantic traditions in this part of the saga.
Well, most of the sagas have their fair share of plot contrivances, don't they? Let's not get too worked up about it.
Well, okay, there is, but there's a lack of artifice to the artifice here, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I rarely do.
Okay. The bones of the story, if we're going to take the book prose line for a minute, are usually a little more clothed than they are here. There's almost an amateurish touch about the way these oaths are deployed at this point in the story. They exist in order to force Gunnlaug and Sigurd into acting a certain way, and they only exist for that reason.
Well, as we said, though, the author is thinking in terms of a different sort of writing here, and maybe is more interested in playing with those story elements than in satisfying the demands of a critical reading.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Relax. Anyway, before Viglund can leave, he sneaks over to Ketilrid's house to announce that he's survived. Yay! It's kind of a bittersweet moment because he's been banished and is on his way out of Iceland, but Viglund once again asks her to wait for him, and Ketilrid reiterates that she can't promise anything, since her father will decide her marriage fate for her.
Boy, the author is really hammering that theme home, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is clearly something very much on his mind, but he's got a surprise in store for us. So anyway, Ketilrid washes and cuts Viglund's hair for him, and...
as one does when one's dead lover turns up alive.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say, yeah. And Viglund swears an oath that no one but Ketilrid will cut or wash his hair as long as she is alive. In fact, he later composes a verse about just this subject. The faithful linen tree gently stroked my locks. Hence I'm in no hurry to have another wash. Never shall another, though near to her in grace, goddess of the bowl, bathe me in my lifetime.
Now, that's a strange oath, but it's not an unprecedented one.
No, it actually mirrors the oath taken by King Harold Fairhair, formerly known as Tangle Locks or Shaggy Hair, not to cut or comb his hair until he completed his conquest of Norway.
And, of course, there's a point later in the story when Viglund's companions get a wash and perm, and Viglund refuses because of his oath to Ketilrid.
A wash and perm? Oh, and before Viglund goes, he speaks a verse for Ketilrid. Pretty maiden, take my poem if it please you, delivered to delight you, brooch-bearer, now and then. When your eyes, Freya, espy the islet garth, your mind will seek me, slender maid, each time. And that's actually fairly typical of Viglund's poetry. Not a technical masterpiece by any means, just a simple bit of verse. But again, it does establish a more romantic feeling.
Right, but it's not the end of this part of the story. After the brothers ride off, Holmkill finds Ketilrid crying. He reveals that he's known for a while that Viglund and Trausti survived, which we didn't know before this point. And he presses her to tell him what will make her happy. And Ketilrid finally tells her father that she wants to marry Viglund and no one else.
Now brace yourselves, because after nearly a year of working our way through these warrior poet sagas, we're about to see something we've never seen before. Holmkill the father is okay with this, and he rides out to tell Viglund to go ahead.
Are you sure you're reading that right? He's not going to try to kill him.
No. Viglund, though, avoids him on the road. So,
well, yeah, he's probably read the other sagas. He knows how this sort of thing usually goes.
Comedy of errors. Yeah, his brother has definitely read them before. He mentions casually that the best chance Viglund has of getting Ketilrid is to take advantage of the moment and kill Holmkill. Oh, can you imagine?
Okay, but we should say in Trousty's defense, he does say it would be a bad idea.
Yeah.
I have to say, I actually kind of like Trousty. He doesn't get a lot of dialogue, but he's got this weirdly sardonic worldview.
He does. Anyway, Viglund finds a message on the road after having hidden, maybe behind the haystacks that Einar and Yokel used. Holmkill left him a pouch of money and a rune stick that recounts everything Ketilrid said. So now Viglund and Ketilrid are all set to be married, right?
Yeah, I know we've done so that's the end of the saga bit before, but this really should be the conclusion. Everything's all wrapped up.
Yeah, except that there's this outlawry thing hanging over the brothers' heads. Oh, and Ketilrid's mother, Thorbjorg, she's still trying to marry Ketilrid off, this time to a neighbor named Thorleif Steinolfsson.
There's always something.
Yeah. So Viglund and Trousty reveal their true identities once they're on Gunnlaug's ship, and it turns out that Sigurd knew who they were because of their sister Helga. Now, do you read that the same way I do, that Helga, their sister, ratted them out?
No, I don't think so. I think it means that he spent a lot of time with Helga. Remember, he's fallen in love with her. Mm-hmm. And he recognizes Viglund as her brother due to a family resemblance.
Sure he does. Well, the four of them, they decide to travel directly to Ketil's home, where Gunnlaug and Sigurd confront their father with this new alliance, and they force him to accept it after all. That's old world power losing to new world power. That's Indeed. Kind of important. Sigurd then proposes that Gunnlaug mediate a settlement between the families.
Isn't he called Gunnlaug the Boisterous? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't think he would be the first choice for negotiating a delicate truce between two kin groups. Why isn't Sigurd the Wise the one arbitrating?
Well, there's a very good reason for that. Gunnlaug's settlement proposal involves a transfer of property rights from Thorgrim's wife, Olaf, to Ketil.
Which is irrelevant to Olaf, since she and Thorgrim are personae non grata in Norway.
Sure, but the important part of the settlement is a double marriage bond. He proposes that his brother marry Helga Thorgrim's daughter, while Trousty will marry Ingebjorg Ketil's daughter, who's now old enough, and it's not as creepy as when Harald Fairhair tried to offer her to Trousty's father years ago. In fact, she's probably kind of old.
Oh, wow. Okay, so ignoring for the moment the still slightly twisted nature of marrying Trousty off to a woman his father was once offered as a wife... this creates a tight bond among the two sets of brothers.
Yes, it does.
Right. Now, this is exactly the sort of bond we saw go terribly wrong in Gisli's saga. But when it does work, it essentially knits two kin groups into one.
Mm-hmm. Especially when they want to do it.
Right.
In fact, from this point on in the saga, the four of them are referred to as the Sworn Brothers. So... Now these sworn brothers spend 3 years traveling and raiding together while they wait out the sentence of outlawry against Viglund and Trousty. And if this was a typical warrior poet saga, we might actually spend some time seeing some of this stuff happen.
Right.
Hearing about their adventures.
About what they're up to.
But not here. That's not the point. The others are very happy, but Viglund can't help pining for Ketilrid the entire time.
Right, and meanwhile, one last complication crops up in Iceland that threatens to derail our happy ending.
No!
Ketilrid's evil mother is pushing hard for Thorleif Steinolfsson to win Ketilrid's hand by any means necessary.
Yeah, he must be really ugly and awful. That's why she wants him. At this point in the story, she's lost any motivation beyond just hating her daughter and wanting her to be miserable.
Well, okay. I mean, to play devil's advocate, Viglund did kill her sons.
Oh, come on.
He had a good reason, but I can sort of see why she wouldn't be a big fan of ending up with him as a son-in-law.
I wish someone would push her down a well.
Wow. So Viglund and Thorleif are both seemingly out of luck at this point because Ketilrid's father suddenly offers her in marriage to a rich elderly suitor named Thord of the Eastfjords.
Oh. You know, at this point I was just beaten down and I figured, yep, that's the formula. No, nothing's going to work out here. But a savvy reader should spot that there is something fishy about this guy. Mm-hmm. He's coming from across the island. He's got no patronymic surname, and he arrives shortly after Ketilrid's father sends some of his men on a secret mission.
But Ketilrid isn't a savvy reader.
No.
She's
Neither was I, to be quite honest.
Well, so a theoretical savvy reader.
Yeah.
If one were present.
If one were present and thinking about these things at the time.
Now, Ketilrid is upset by what she sees as her father's betrayal of her, and remains grim-faced and silent throughout the wedding.
Yeah, but there are hints that she eventually learns something's up. She and Thord return to his home after the wedding, but their sleeping arrangements are designed to keep her virtue intact. And I must say, I did get a little suspicious at this point.
Yeah, we're told quite clearly that Thord did not celebrate his wedding with her.
But regardless of whatever scheme is afoot, no one tells Viglund about it at all. And so he returns to Iceland and eventually makes his way to the Eastfjords, where he stumbles onto the farm where Thord and Ketilrid live. He's very angry, and he's upset to learn that she's gotten married again, and he kind of loses his mind a little bit. Yes, understandably so.
Yeah, it gets pretty bad. In fact, one night, he creeps over to where Thord and Ketilrid are sleeping, stares down at them, and begins to draw his sword.
This reminded me very much of a Gisli saga.
You see, it reminded me of Norman Bates.
Is he wearing his mother's dress and wig?
No, but it absolutely is a parallel to Gisli Saga. And things could get very messy in a hurry here. But Trausti sees what Viglund is doing and tells him in no uncertain terms to man up and not shame himself.
Trust in Trausti. That's
there
my motto.
Go. He even adds a verse. You'll never, breaker of rings, win the maid in wedlock if you harm the good ruler of Fafnir's great realm. Dealing blows with weapons does not solve dilemmas. We two brothers must behave beyond blame and reproach.
Is Trausti also known as Mr. Ed, the talking horse?
What?
Because he sounds a lot like him.
You'll never, breaker of rings, win the maid in wedlock. That's very different.
Yeah, anyone under 30 has no idea what we're talking about. So this is actually another new piece to add to the poet saga genre. The poet's brother is composing verses.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a reason that not everyone agrees the saga belongs with the others. What I think is most interesting about this is that Trausti's verses are at least as well composed as Viglund's.
Oh, yeah.
And seem to show greater erudition.
In any case, this verse is enough to bring Viglund back to reality, and he goes back to bed.
So this goes on for a while.
A little anticlimactic.
It really is. But it is this moment when you see Viglund kind of right at the edge of becoming a criminal. So the brothers end up staying with Thord for the winter, and in the spring he goes on a trip and asks them to watch over his farm. And of course the implication being also to watch over his bride. When he returns a month later, he has all their friends from the west with him. Their parents, Thorgrim and Olaf, their sister, Helga.
No way.
Sigurd and Gunnlaug, their sworn brothers, Ketilrid's father, Holmkill, and all their friends and relations. Suddenly it's an episode of This Is Your Life.
Yeah. And even then, Viglund has to have the whole thing explained to him.
Yeah.
Thord reveals himself to be Helgi, the son of Earl Eric of Rogaland. Surprise!
Okay. Now, that was a surprise. Yeah. This is one of those late in the saga cameos, like Ari Sursen showing up in the final paragraphs of Gisli Saga to avenge his brother.
Yeah. And if anyone hasn't been keeping score of all the names in this saga, which is understandable, remember that way back at the beginning of the saga, Thorgrim was introduced as the illegitimate son of Earl Eric, who also had two legitimate sons.
Right. So Helgi is actually Thorgrim's half-brother and Viglund's uncle. Unbelievable.
Exactly. We learned that Holmkill, Thorgrim, and Helgi cooked up this whole thing to protect Ketilrid from her mother's plots to marry her off and to preserve her for Viglund. How nice.
It's lovely, which means the only issue still to be resolved is Holmkill's feelings about Viglund having killed his sons. They were terrible sons, admittedly, but they were still the only ones he had.
And even this gets resolved happily. Viglund kneels in front of Holmkill, who says, "Better that your head stay on your neck, for that would please my daughter more."
That's a nice line to end it on.
Yeah.
And that's it. Viglund and Ketilrid are finally able to marry. And since Gunnlaug is the only remaining bachelor among the sworn brothers, he gets married to Helgi Eriksson's daughter Ragnhild, because why not? cementing the four friends and their spouses together as one happy family.
That's right.
We get the rarest of things in the sagas, a truly and completely happy ending for all.
Indeed. And something else that's interesting about this particular saga is that it ends with a little coda. The saga author writes, Thanks be to the one who composed the stories and wrote them down. Amen.
So thanks to me for writing this, essentially?
Yeah, I guess so.
Nice.
Or maybe saying that there's a copier. But the amen at the end is something that intrigues me a great deal. Mm-hmm. And I think just because our young lovers are together, it doesn't mean our work is done. We need to unpack a little bit of that. And we also have some judgments to hand out.
Oh, yes. And I think we've both got some things to say about this one.
Mm-hmm.
But that'll have to wait for our next episode.
Until then, you can follow us on Twitter at Saga Thing Pod. Check us out on Facebook at Saga Thing Podcast, and go to our website, sagathingpodcast.wordpress.com. Email us at sagathingpodcast@gmail.com or something like that. Anything else, John?
No, just until next time. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.
When your eyes, Freya, espy the islet?
Islet.
No, it's islet. Wendy made fun of me last time.
Islet.
It's islet.
Hang on.
I don't know. But last time I think we said islet, and my wife was very upset with us because she mispronounced everything. And she finally got me.
She's right.
Yeah.
She's right. Wow, I've always said islet.
Not anymore.